Is it morally wrong for dogs to have kids? Well, it wouldn't be the dog that's doing anything morally wrong, but maybe it would be you. In this video, I want to explore the topic of companion animal antinatalism. Specifically, if our duty under antinatalism not to create other sentient beings has implications for how we keep companion animals. First, I'm going to lay out why I think it does, then I'm going to go through what I think that practically looks like, and then I'm going to respond to some objections. So, let's get into it. I believe the duty under antinatalism not to create other sentient beings does have implications for how we keep companion animals. And in very brief summary, I think that means that we should not breed them and we should not allow them to breed amongst each other. When we take on responsibility for guardianship of a companion animal, I believe that we also take on at least some of the responsibility for the consequences of their actions. Whilst some companion animals can be held at least somewhat responsible for some of their actions, they don't have the cognitive capacity nor the command of any given situation to be held fully responsible for their actions or blameworthy. They only have a limited capacity to understand the consequences of their actions. As the guardians of companion animals, I believe their limited responsibility for the consequence of their actions results in our assuming as their guardians some or all of the rest of the responsibility. We have a more developed understanding of the consequences of their actions, alongside more capacity to actually avoid the negative consequences of their actions. And it's widely recognized that we take on such responsibility completely voluntarily when we become their guardian. I see this as a similar level of responsibility that a parent would have for a very young child and the consequences of their actions. They also have a similarly limited understanding of the consequences. Let's look at an example. If the guardian of a puppy had not toilet trained this puppy, and the puppy then proceeds to go to the toilet on their neighbor's carpet, I believe it's reasonable to hold the guardian responsible for this and for them to pay for any damages. The guardian knew when adopting the puppy that they would need toilet training. They also knew that if they didn't toilet train the puppy, that instances like this could occur. On top of that, they also had the capacity to toilet train the puppy at no significant cost to themselves or the puppy, but either decided not to or just didn't prioritize it. These considerations, in my eyes, count in favor of the idea that a guardian of a companion animal is responsible, at least in part, for the consequences of their actions. Basically, the consequences of a companion animal's actions count at least to some extent towards a guardian not fulfilling their negative duty if the same consequences had stemmed from the guardian themselves committing the action, like for example damaging a neighbor's carpet and not fulfilling your negative duty to not damage their property. Hopefully that makes sense and it's a relatively uncontroversial example. Let's move on to antinatalism now. The question is whether the reproducing of a companion animal, whether facilitated by the guardian or just occurring between companion animals, counts against the guardian fulfilling their negative duty under antinatalism not to create new sentient beings. I believe it does. If a guardian is responsible for the damages done to a neighbor's carpet by the puppy they're responsible for toileting on it, then it seems plausible that a guardian is responsible for the harms done to the offspring of a companion animal they are responsible for by them reproducing. In both instances, the actions of a companion animal count against a guardian fulfilling their negative duty. Similarly to the example of toileting, the guardian knows when adopting their companion animal that they will be fertile and can reproduce. And they also know that not implementing appropriate measures to avoid reproduction may result in new sentient beings being created. On top of that, they have the capacity to implement such measures. Perhaps the one key difference here is whether there are significant costs involved in these appropriate measures to prevent reproduction, as they would likely be more significant than any measures needed to avoid disagreeable toileting. We'll come back to this later though. There's also another dimension to this, and that is that our refusing or delaying to implement appropriate measures to avoid reproduction can actually make it harder for others to fulfill their negative duty, others being other guardians of companion animals. If we're to let our fertile companion animal have inappropriately controlled contact with the opposite sex of their species such that reproduction could occur, even when the guardians of those other companion animals have actually tried to put in appropriate measures to avoid reproduction, reproduction, then we're making it harder for them to fulfill their negative duty not to create sentient beings. For example, if I am the guardian of a male cat that is fertile and I allow them to roam around and wander in and out of the windows left open completely innocently by the guardians of female cats, then reproduction could occur despite those other guardians taking appropriate measures, but maybe just in an honest mistake leaving a window open. Of course, it might be a failing on their part that they have left this window open, but given that the window is open, I have made it harder for them to fulfill their negative duty by allowing my fertile male cat to just wander around freely, because I'm not taking appropriate measures to avoid them reproducing. So now let's get to what this means for us in practical terms. The way I see it, there are three key implications for how we keep companion animals. The first is how a guardian even comes to have a companion animal in the first place. They can either purchase them from a breeding operation, or they could adopt them from an organization, an individual, or from a feral environment. Hopefully it should be kind of clear and uncontroversial that purchasing a companion animal from a breeding operation, therefore creating demand for more companion animals to be bred, is of course in contradiction with our duty not to create other sentient beings. I'm not going to go into this anymore here. I've done a whole video that surrounds this, which is up on screen now, and I've linked it in the description if you want to check that out. The second implication is that we should put in place appropriate measures to avoid our companion animal reproducing. There are multiple ways to do this, and which one is most appropriate is going to be in part decided by the specific needs of your companion animal. It would be tedious to go through all the nuances of every species and every perceivable situation someone can be in with a companion animal. So I'm just going to lay out some general methods. The first is that a guardian could have their companion animal sterilized. The second is that they could control the access that their companion animal has with fertile members of the opposite sex of their species. And the third is that they could just avoid their companion animal having any contact with fertile members of the opposite sex of their species. Of course, each of these methods will have their own pros and cons, and some will be more appropriate for some species and less appropriate for others. Which method is most appropriate for a given companion animal is probably best decided by their guardian, informed by an expert on the topic. Unless, of course, sterilization is mandated in the region or country you live in. For example, Spain has introduced mandatory sterilizations for cats under the age of 6 months. The third is that we should avoid funding the creation of other animals for the purposes of feeding our companion animal. For some companion animals, this isn't an issue because they're herbivorous, but for others, like omnivorous or carnivorous species, this is an issue we have to consider. Again, I've gone over this in a previous video, and I think all the general points made in that video also apply to companion animals, so do check that out. It is possible for some omnivorous or carnivorous companion animals to be transitioned to a fully plant-based diet, but of course if you're going to do this with your companion animal, then solicit professional advice. I'm not an expert. Many dogs though, for example, can be completely happy and healthy on a fully plant-based diet and have no issues at all. And there are a range of plant-based dog foods on the market. Some cats can also be happy and healthy on a plant-based diet, and there are some 100% plant-based cat foods on the market, but there are less than dog foods, and it is generally a trickier transition for cats. Hopefully this isn't an issue we're going to have to face for much longer though, because there is a technology coming down the road, and actually in some cases already here, which is lab-grown or cultivated meat for companion animals. Meatly, for example, is a company in the UK that has been approved by the UK regulator to produce cultivated meat for companion animals, and excitingly their first product has already hit the shelves in the UK. It is a dog treat at Pets at Home, which is a companion animal company in the UK, and the product contains cultivated chicken meat. This would allow companion animals to continue their meat-based diets, but without relying on a system that creates sentient beings into existence, often to have horrible lives. Obviously, I don't know the situation of every guardian and their companion animal out there, so each guardian is going to have to make their own judgment on what is most appropriate for their companion animal on any of these points I've just said. So, objection number one, sterilizing companion animals violates their autonomy. There are many things to say here, but the first thing to say is that obviously there are non-sterilization methods for avoiding your companion animal reproducing. Each form of prevention has their own pros and cons, but obviously in this section I'm going to be focusing on sterilization. I'm personally generally in support of sterilizing companion animals where we can and where there aren't significant costs to the companion animal, but I also recognize there are a range of considerations around this. So let's dive in. Whilst it is true that a sterilization sterilization procedure would compromise the autonomy of a companion animal, there are some other relevant considerations we need to take into account before making a judgment as to whether such a procedure is justifiable. The first consideration is that a sterilization procedure is the only one out of the methods that is really going to guarantee no accidents happen and reproduction occurs by accident. The other methods, if they're 100% implemented, can avoid reproduction, but we all know that people and companion animals are fallible, and so accidents can happen. And I think the importance of this consideration really comes into focus when we consider the magnitude of the harms that will be imposed on any offspring that do result from reproduction, which for many species there will often be multiple of them. So let's remind ourselves of it. In their book chapter Reproducing Companion Animals, Jessica Totoit and David Benatar discuss the harms of coming into existence for companion animals. The harms of existence are considerable. This is true for all sentient beings, but our focus here is only on a subset of those beings, companion animals. To be sure, many such animals suffer less harm than do the vast majority of animals who are reared for human consumption. The harms are nonetheless more substantial than people typically recognize. They begin by discussing the frustrations that are pervasive in many of the lives of our companion animals. Consider the restrictions on companion animals' freedom. These are very severe in the case of many companion birds and rodents, as well as other mammals who are caged. These animals effectively have a lifetime of incarceration, perhaps with occasional furloughs. This must be enormously frustrating. Other companion animals, such as dogs, are often not caged. However, their movement is restricted by closed doors, house walls, garden fences, and leashes. This frustrates their ability to pursue, among other things, the scents and sex they seek. It also leads to separation anxiety when their companion humans leave them. If they're left for long periods, boredom can result. Humans also restrict animals' freedom with regards to what and how much they eat. Dogs, for example, regularly beg for food that is withheld from them. The claim is not that restrictions on the freedom of companion animals are unwarranted. They are often justified by the welfare of the animals. Many companion animals would stand a high chance of being harmed if they had unrestricted movement. They would be killed by predators or motor vehicles, for example. Thus, given the existence of these animals and the dangers of the surrounding environment, even if that environment is humanely constructed, it is often indeed best, all things considered, to restrict companion animals' freedom in some ways, but not others. However, animals typically do not understand this, and we need to recognize that their lives include significant frustration as a result. This is very relevant when we are considering whether these animals should be brought into existence at all. They then go on to detail various practices that are common in the breeding industry for companion animals, like tail docking, declawing, and the separation of young from their parents. And then they continue with the following. Arguably worse, and usually longer lasting, are the ravages of aging and disease. Just like humans, they go blind and deaf. They develop skin diseases, arthritis, dysplasia, or any number of cardiac, endocrine, gastrointestinal, urological, or dental diseases. They become paralyzed or epileptic, contract infections, and become infested and suffer malignancies. It should go without saying that this is merely a partial list. Even the luckiest companion animals will experience at least some of the above. Matters are still worse for the unlucky ones. Millions of dogs, cats, and other animals who should be companions to humans are in fact neglected or abused by members of our species. The full spectrum of this abuse is appalling. Animals are left chained and alone in disagreeable conditions. They are starved, beaten, mutilated, burnt, and killed. These harms are significant and should be taken into account. The second consideration is that a sterilization procedure may not, in the context of a typical companion animal's life, meaningfully detract from their autonomy. Consider that sterilization for females would avoid the deleterious effects that pregnancy and birth would have on their autonomy, and the associated health risks of both these things that would further depreciate their autonomy. Sterilization can also facilitate companion animals living more gregariously alongside other members of their species and even other members of other species, which would help them fulfill their need for play and socializing. They would also no longer be fertile, and so they would be more free to appropriately pursue any sexual desires that they had, without the risk of imposing harm on any new beings that would be created as a result. These factors seem to count in favor of sterilization being a benefit to at least some companion animals, or at least not being deleterious. So whilst there may be an initial infringement on their autonomy, it's not clear that a sterilization procedure would actually have an overall negative impact on a companion animal's autonomy. It might even have a positive impact in some cases. As Dutoit and Benatar say, in the absence of long-term animal contraception, the means we have for preventing animals from breeding are either restricting their access to mates or sterilizing them. Preventing animals from mating adds to their frustration and makes the quality of these animals' lives worse. Sterilization avoids that problem, but surgery comes with some risks as well as post-operative discomfort that also diminishes the quality of that animal's life, albeit for a limited period. Although sterilisation does carry some costs for the animal sterilised, our choices are stark. Either we inflict this limited harm on existing animals, or we allow many more suffering animals to be created. We cannot leave the choice to the reproducing animals because they are not able to make the decision for themselves. We, as their custodians, need to decide. Some also raise the issue of consent. Companion animals cannot give informed consent, particularly concerning a sterilisation procedure, but they also can't give informed consent for something like pregnancy, which a sterilisation procedure would avoid. This is in the case of females, obviously. Of course, in the case of males, they would not be at risk of pregnancy, but their guardians would be partly responsible for any pregnancies that their male companion animal plays a part in causing. Pregnancy and birth carry risks and implications for a companion animal, and should count as something that one should have to give informed consent for experiencing and going through. We recognise this in the human context. As such, it seems like a false dichotomy to present on one hand the violation of consent with a sterilisation procedure, but not on the other hand the potential violation of consent with pregnancy. Fertile females, at least, are at risk of a significant burden that they cannot give informed consent to taking on. It's also true that companion animals just generally lack the ability to give informed consent for many things, including medical checks or medical procedures, but we recognise as guardians that we must make decisions on their behalf. Now, some may say that medical checks or medical procedures are done for the benefit of the companion animal themselves, but there are also instances where we put restrictions on them and do things without their informed consent that are mainly driven to benefit others. For example, if we have a companion animal that is a dog that is maybe suffering from trauma that results in them being particularly aggressive, we often always keep them on a lead and even muzzle them without being able to get informed consent from them for the benefit of others, because they may be harmed by our companion animal, even if it's unintentionally done by them. If sterilisation can be avoided and sufficiently effective methods can be used to prevent our companion animal reproducing, then of course, all else being equal, it would be preferable to avoid the sterilisation procedure. The surgery does come with some level of risk, and there is post-operative discomfort. And the evidence, for example, in dogs is mixed as to whether sterilising companion animals is beneficial for their health or deleterious to their health. The guaranteed and potential harms of sterilisation here should be taken into account when we make this decision, and avoided if possible. Again, each guardian and their companion animal will be in a different set of conditions that I can't possibly comment on, and I'm not qualified to comment on. The guardian must come to a decision as to which means of avoiding reproducing is most appropriate for their companion animal. Very quickly before we move on, I just wanted to let you know as well that I have included a general list of some materials that dive into the ethics of sterilisation. If you want somewhere to start your learning on this topic, it's linked in the description. Objection 2. It hasn't proved possible to transition my companion animal to a plant-based diet, and there is no affordable lab meat available at present. So it's true that some companion animals won't take to a plant-based diet, and it's also true that cultivated meat or lab-grown meat generally is not going to be available in everyone's area, and even if it is, it may not be affordable. Obviously, hopefully this changes in the future. As such, some companion animals won't be able to transition away from a diet which relies on the breeding of other animals. This is an unfortunate fact of the current situation we find ourselves in, and just testament to how messed up existence is. Of course, companion animals should not be starved. Guardians have a duty of care towards their companion animals, and should continue to feed them whilst preferably trying to minimize the contribution they have to supporting breeding operations. One example of how this could be done is to source the meat that you provide to your companion animal from places that would not necessarily contribute to demand for more meat, like butchers' offcuts. Another speculative example is just purchasing meat for your companion animal that comes from larger animals, such that over the course of your companion animal's lifetimes, they're contributing to at least less of those animals being bred into existence for them to eat. None of this is nice, and it certainly isn't perfect, but it may be the best a guardian can do whilst fulfilling their duty of care to their companion animal. I don't have any perfect answers here. If you think you have better answers, then please leave them in the comments below. Objection 3. All of this denies companion animals the joy of reproduction. There are joys associated with reproduction, like the relationship that a companion animal can have with their offspring. The denial of this opportunity for companion animals, though, is maybe not as significant as the objector may think. In her book chapter, Does Preventing Reproduction Make for Bad Care?, Catherine Wayne explores the question as to whether humans have a duty not to stand in the way of companion animal reproduction. She provides a fuller analysis that I'm going to go into here. I'm also only going to take aspects of her argument that I think are keenly relevant to the points I'm trying to make. So if you're interested, I recommend reading her full chapter. Anyway, let's begin. It It may be that companion animals do not look forward to the activities and experiences that encourage their flourishing, but they may experience deep satisfaction through them and appreciate the goods that are afforded to them by virtue of participating. So companion animals may not conceive of a future where they have reproduced and look forward longingly to it in the same way that many humans do. But this does not change the fact that if they do reproduce, they may very well find a lot of value in having done that. Wayne then goes on to say, companion animals may value the experience of having and raising offspring. That experience may even represent an essential component of flourishing for some of them. Unlike humans, however, not only are companion animals generally less able to self-regulate their reproductive behaviors, they are by nature unable to limit their reproduction in a way that is consistent with the grounding value of reproduction itself. Where I agree with Wayne is that the value that companion animals may find in having reproduced could be diminished or completely compromised by their lack of ability to self-regulate their reproductive behavior. As such, for this value to be realized in a meaningful way, humans are probably going to have to play a part in controlling their reproduction anyway, at least to some degree. Where I differ from Wayne, though, is in the understanding that the potential value of reproduction could be essential to their flourishing. This seems unlikely to me. There are a plethora of ways in which a companion animal could live a good life alongside humans and other animals, including sometimes even wild animals. As Wayne says herself, perhaps supplying opportunities for nurturing others and for sex as activities associated with reproduction would suffice to protect companion animals' interests. The range of ways in which a good life can be rendered for companion animals, in my eyes, makes a lack of reproduction mostly a non-issue. And Wayne concludes herself, human caregivers and institutions are not, as a matter of principle, failing companion animals by not facilitating their reproduction, and that preventing reproduction in companion animals is therefore not, again in principle, in tension with fulfilling the duty of care to them. Pursuing these other means of providing your companion animal with a good life also has the benefit of avoiding imposing harm on offspring through a companion animal reproducing, which in my eyes is a significant benefit. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on this topic. Let me know if you disagreed with anything I said. Put anything down below in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.